Welcome to Altered Mates, a philosophical podcast hosted by Alejandro Tuama and Tobias Penno, two mates fascinated by altered states. Stay tuned for a conversational journey through the murky depths of consciousness, psyche, and the human experience. To find out more to support the podcast, please go to alteredmates.com. We hope you enjoy the ride.
Welcome to Altered Mates. Tobias here, one half of two mates altered by the psychedelic experience and still unraveling exactly what happened to me. Join us in the lab, as we affectionately call our studio, where we experiment and test out our psychedelic ideas and try to develop models for understanding the world. In this episode, we explore the intriguing world of psychedelic research in Communist Czechoslovakia. In particular, we delve into a paper written by Sarah Marks, which we stumbled upon in the midst of our deep dive into psychosis, but which has revealed much more than a story about psychosis. A fascinating history which, for me at least, helps to contextualize much of the psychedelic conversations that we have today. The paper is titled, From Experimental Psychosis to Resolving Traumatic Pasts, Psychedelic Research in Communist Czechoslovakia, 1954 to 1974. This episode is a bit more laid back than our usual affair, but hey, that is part of its charm. So sit back, relax, and get ready to embark on a journey into the past with our discussion based on Mark's fascinating paper. A quick shout out to all our listeners. It's great to see people from all across the globe are tuning into these yarns. We appreciate your ongoing support and your engagement online. And of course, for this one, a special shout out to our Czech mates. All right, let's dive in.
Yes. And we've got a couple of papers to look at today. The first one that we're going to look at is a Czechoslovakian paper. From Experimental Psychosis to Resolving Traumatic Pasts is the title of the paper. Psychedelic Research in Communist Czechoslovakia, 1954 to 1974. So from my reading of it, it's like it goes into the history of basically two projects that the Czechoslovakian researchers were engaging in.
Yeah.
And one of them they label experimental psychosis and the other one is LSD psychotherapy. And so the first one, the experimental psychosis, it seems like the idea is let's take a whole bunch of LSD as researchers and see if that gives insight into psychosis. And that's where that whole psychomimetic thing came from.
Yeah.
Ultimately, the research, it didn't support that hypothesis. And then there came a second usage, a second project for LSD, which is in psychotherapy. So instead of using LSD for the researchers to try to figure out what psychosis, they used it as a tool for therapy with their patients.
Yes. Although, just to counter that perspective.
Which perspective?
The in particular that it was a failed experiment. Like
why don't we can go into it. So rather than like just glancing over it, we can actually talk about what they found, and then you can actually say why that wasn't a fail.
Yeah, sure. Well, yeah, let's do that.
So this particular piece of research began in 1954. A number of researchers across different institutes in Prague. Now, I like this. In the column I wrote, proper research, underline exclamation point. So, in part, the purpose of these experiments was to record the psychological effects of hallucinogenic drugs, ranging from psilocybin, mescaline, adrenochrome, to the newly synthesized lysergic acid LSD. During the 50s and the 60s, the researchers themselves ingested the various compounds and compared their respective effects, including their impact on time perception, thought processes, types of optical hallucination, and a range of emotional responses experienced. Yeah, so the research is you got your scientist crew and you just take all the drugs.
Yeah.
And they said that the particularly LSD seemed to mimic psychotic states observed in psychiatric patients with a diagnosis of schizophrenia. So I guess that's the idea. That was their idea.
Yeah.
That by taking these drugs, it could give them insight into what was going on with people who have psychosis.
Yes. And that's kind of where like there is a theory of psychosis called, I think, the serotonin hypothesis, which is, these days the serotonin hypothesis is more connected to depression, but then because they knew that LSD was a 5-HT2A antagonist, or a serotonin receptor antagonist, they figured if it is mimicking psychosis, then the serotonin system must be implicated in psychosis. And no doubt it is in some way, but that was not a sufficient theory, I don't think that has evolved into a sufficient theory to explain psychosis. And I don't think, as far as I'm aware, there's any biological explanation for psychosis that in and of itself is a sufficient explanation, but they were looking for it. So basically the first generation antipsychotics were called neuroleptics because they induced this state of neurolepsis, a kind of like really intense sense of anhedonia and blunting of emotional reactivity. It just kind of like, it was a very effective suppressive drug, and
which curiously is one of the symptoms. It's like the negative symptoms.
Yeah, that's right. And like the one of the symptoms is grossly disorganized like behavior, and one of the effects of especially the first gen antipsychotics was these extrapyramidal side effects which affect your body in that way. So yeah. Anyway,
but I guess people like that are easier to take care of, control.
Yeah, well, yeah, and that's it. I think that's it, right? They're very effective at reducing the so-called positive effects of psychosis, and making people very manageable. And yeah, but they had these really horrible side effects, and so people were chasing different psychotics that had less of those. Yep. And that's when they came up with the second generation antipsychotics, or the atypical. So first gen antipsychotics, basically on a biological, mechanical level, they antagonize the dopamine receptors, the D2 dopamine receptors, right? Which by antagonizing them, they reduce the transmission of dopamine, which is what helps reduce the symptoms of psychosis. Second gen or atypical antipsychotics do that to the dopamine receptors, as well as, interestingly, the 5-HT2A receptors, the very same receptors that psychedelics interact with. And so the only difference on that mechanical level is that they're antagonizing both dopamine and serotonin receptors. And they have less of those extrapyramidal, or none as far as I know, of those extrapyramidal side effects, but they're still gnarly as fuck. Like clozapine killed heaps of people and was withdrawn from the European market at some point because it causes some issue with your blood, which can lead to death like years after even stopping taking the medication. They still use clozapine now for treatment-resistant psychosis. Mm-hmm. So if you're really far down the rabbit hole and none of the first-line antipsychotics have worked, then they'll bring out the clozapine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But they won't bring out the LSD like they did back in the day.
No.
So I think, still related to the research that was being done over in Czechoslovakia, or in what was Czechoslovakia, which is now the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And I guess, so it would be the Czech Republic because it was mostly being done in Prague. I like what they call auto-experimentation. So I just want to read this bit, what that Sarah Marks says. Now, talking about this researcher who, I don't know if I've got the pronunciation right, but it looks like Rubicek. Or that's like a Australianized way to say his name. So in his introduction to the book, Rubicek made sure to embed the experiments within a long tradition of Czech pharmacological research from before the Second World War involving auto-experimentation and an interest in the psychological effects of different substances. In 1924, for example, Otakar Janota published the results of his experiment with ingesting cocaine and morphine together and recording the results. That's what people used to do, and it's called speedballing, when you mix heroin and cocaine together.
I've never heard of that.
I only came across that. I read Anthony Kiedis, the frontman for the Red Hot Chili Peppers.
Uh-huh.
I read his autobiography,
Okay.
and he talks about speedballing a lot. So fucking Janota was doing this as 1924.
What is that like? Cocaine and morphine?
Well, I guess, the idea is, that you have the feeling chilled from the heroin.
Yeah.
But then the little pick-me-up of the cocaine.
Yes. I can see how that would be conducive to good music production.
Well, in a similar way to the way that I've experimented with using psilocybin, dexamphetamines, and alcohol.
Yes.
A little bit of vodka, a little bit of psilocybin, a little bit of dexies on the dance floor at a festival, barefoot, music's going.
Yes.
It's like, because the mushroom has a tendency to push me down onto the ground and make me like go introspective, and then the Dexy kind of like lifts me up and makes me dance, that kind of thing.
And the alcohol just takes the inhibitions away.
Yeah, it takes a little bit of the anxiety of like, the world's getting weird. So that's what Janota back in the 20s was doing.
Yeah.
Sarah Marks goes on to say, later in 1947, psychiatrist Svetozar Nevole experimented with mescaline, concluding the drug had allowed him to experience four-dimensional space. In turn, these authors saw themselves as following a legitimate scientific tradition of auto-experimentation pioneered in the Czech lands by Jan Evangelista Perkine. And then later, this is funny, when new compounds were synthesized by his colleague Miroslav Protiva at the Institute for Pharmacy and Biochemistry, Vitova would test them on himself before conducting patient trials. Aldrich Wiener later recalled that, quote, you sometimes knew there was a new drug around when you saw Votava lying in the corridor. You knew if they'd got a new batch. When this guy's like rolling around. Whoa!
This is a good one, guys.
Yeah.
Everybody try. Yes.
But don't you just love that as this is the method that before you're giving anything to these patients, you're testing it on yourself.
Yeah.
I'm not going to give this guy anything that I haven't put in my own body and seen what it does to my body first.
Yeah. Legit. They don't do that anymore. And I wonder if they would be so generous with their prescriptions if they had. I dare say probably not.
Probably not.
Yeah. And yeah.
So, okay. Did you read the bit about the EEGs? So this is leading up towards the end of the experimental psychosis project. And I don't know if I fully grasped what was going on. So I'm just going to check in on a few of these bits. Electroencephalography the measure of electrical activity by means of placing multiple electrodes on the scalp was one of the tests carried out on both sets of subjects in the experimental psychosis project. And so I think the idea is they were using that to measure like people with psychosis, and then also researchers who had taken LSD, and they had hoped to see similar results.
Right.
The hoped for similarities, this is quoting, between schizophrenia and experimental psychosis is the researchers who've taken the LSD, appeared to be weak.
Yeah.
Analyses of the graphic images produced by the LSD subjects showed marked differences from what the experimenters characterized as typical artistic features of patients with schizophrenia. And then further down, I'm quoting again, ultimately, the experimental psychosis researchers concluded that there were too many significant differences between experimental psychosis and schizophrenia for the two states to have any functional similarity.
Yes. So it was abandoned, that idea. You know, it's funny that in the book Rethinking Madness, they talk about this history in the same kind of era, and apparently a bunch of the scientists at that time were so convinced that the LSD experimental psychosis was the same as the schizophrenia that they sort of had this hypothesis that there must be an endogenous substance that is produced by the brain when we have a real schizophrenia that acts in the same way as LSD, like an endogenous psychedelic or substance. And so that was one of the things that they were looking for, like what is the thing that the brain releases. However, as they became more and more clear that these two were, distinct phenomena, they gave up on that. But I'm still unconvinced.
So related to that.
Yeah.
This is further in the paper, almost at the end. Well, this is at the end of the experimental psychosis section.
Yeah.
Marx writes, in large part, their turn away from the biochemical model can be seen as a consequence of the failure of the experimental psychosis project to prove a scientific commonality between psychedelic and psychotic experience. Citing Eugene Bleuler, they admitted the lack of evidence for the so-called, quote, serotonin hypothesis, on which much of their experimental psychosis work had been based, which had posited that hallucinogenic experience was caused by serotonin antagonism of the central nervous system, because this was how the effects of LSD were explained.
Yes.
Later on, this turned back. Oh yeah. It's going into the next section. This turned back towards psychoanalysis after the failure of the experimental psychosis project led to new experimentation in the use of LSD as a psychotherapeutic catalyst, which is where we go to next. But I wouldn't mind just hearing your thoughts on that bit there about the lack of evidence for the serotonin hypothesis and the turning away from the biochemical model.
Well,
can you frame that for me?
I think that the whole premise of psychiatry in its origin is that mental health or mental unhealth is a consequence of because if the brain is what produces consciousness, and then when consciousness is affected in a way that leads to mental ill health, then and we're approaching it from a medical model, that sort of like old paradigm where the body is basically a mechanism, like a car, and like, if you're having this a problem with your kidneys, then let's just go in there and we'll cut it out, or we'll give you a drug and fix that up. In the same way, they applied the same logic to the brain and to mental health. So if you're having a problem with your mental health, you're schizophrenic, for example, then there must be a error in your brain.
Yeah,
you've got an imbalance in the chemicals.
So the chemistry is out. Let's take out some of this chemical. Let's put in some of this chemical.
Yeah,
we'll adjust the balance in the chemicals.
Yep,
and then that'll equal healthy.
Yeah. Or a little bit older, a little bit earlier, we'll just cut a part of the brain out. that's the part that's problematic.
That's your shonky part.
We'll just give you a lobotomy.
We'll just get rid of this right hemisphere. Let's just take all of that
and
out.
Interestingly, it's kind of similar, right? Like you got somebody who's, let's say, hysterical, quote unquote. You give them a frontal lobotomy and they become lobotomized and they have no real function anymore. They're not mentally unwell in the same way as they were before. They're just completely kind of like nullified as a human. And you give somebody enough antipsychotics and you get the same kind of effect.
But they're not hallucinating anymore? Or maybe they just can't communicate that they are hallucinating because they can't fucking speak anymore.
I have a quote here from the book Rethinking Madness that I think is interesting.
Who wrote that one?
That is written by Paris. I do not remember their surname, but we'll
your mate Paris Hilton.
My mate Paris Hilton. So
it's not Paris Hilton.
Sorry, I wasn't really listening to you. So I quote: "Soon after the endogenous substance theory had begun to fade away, the one that we just mentioned, the first dopamine imbalance hypothesis was posited. In 1951, the French naval surgeon Henry Laborit accidentally stumbled upon a drug which had such a powerful numbing effect on his surgical patients that they needed almost no anesthetic. Laborit also noticed that the drug seemed to put his patients into a strange daze in which they seemed completely indifferent to anything going on around them, and yet they maintained enough cognizance to answer questions. One of his colleagues noticed that this effect was very similar to that seen in lobotomized patients, and he suggested it may be useful in psychiatry. So this drug that we're talking about is chlorpromazine, which is one of the first antipsychotics that was used. Chlorpromazine.
Yeah, but I think that was one of the brands.
Yes. Yeah.
Branded as Thorazine.
Yeah. So as we've unwittingly stumbled upon, that was literally part of the logic of using antipsychotics in its origin. Was like, oh, this seems to have the same effect as a lobotomy.
Yeah.
How great.
Excellent. And
Excellent.
we don't even have to bother with going into surgery. We can lobotomize chemically.
Yes. Oh, that's an interesting reframe of what an antipsychotic is. A chemical lobotomy.
Yeah.
Oof. Okay. So, that's the chemical imbalance theory, and the debate still rages on today in psychiatry around the sort of like what hypothesis supports what chemical theory explains what mental illness. Like, I mean, and it's not just raging in schizophrenia; it's also raging in depression.
Well, that's what I was going to say. That like that's a huge industry is the antidepressants, all based on the idea that there's nothing wrong with you except a simple chemical imbalance, and that all you need to do is take this particular drug for the rest of your life, and you'll be fine.
That's right. They're published in. So I was teaching my students in social work this semester about this.
Yeah.
Because I wanted to just like cast some uncertainty around these like oversimplified explanations. Sometimes people are like, oh yeah, I had depression and it's because my brain chemistry was imbalanced, and then I took some antidepressants and now it's been fixed.
Yeah.
And like that, if that's a useful narrative to hang off, then sure, that's fine, but it's just not accurate.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to show them that, and I found these two journal articles that were published this year in Molecular Psychiatry. The first was a systematic umbrella review of the research around serotonin and depression. And it's like...
Because like a lot of those antidepressants are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors.
Yeah, that's right. And so this was like a review of the reviews. Like, how there's the top tier of science, which is the meta-review.
Yeah.
This was like pooling all the meta-analyses. And basically they concluded that that serotonin, there's no strong evidence to say that serotonin imbalance is what causes depression. And it was a very compelling article. And then like a month later, a whole like team of experts responded with an article published in the same journal that was titled
Shut up.
Basically, they called it "A Leaky Umbrella Has Little Value." And then basically tried to tear apart their ideas. But it just shows that there are some really powerful and really intelligent people that are still really hung up on this idea that it's a brain disorder, it's an imbalance, there's something has gone wrong with the brain, and then in contrast to that is, the newer ideas which, you and I often talk about, that something like depression is a functional signal. Yeah. It's like your body is saying, hey,
or
something's...
Like often how you talk about in social work, that it's a function of the environment, that it's like, it's not just about the individual, it's like the way that their whole life is structured, their interactions with their family and work and wider community, as well as like the physical health of their body and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And that if you can address the whole picture, then all of a sudden, well, I'm not depressed anymore. Yeah. But that's really fucking hard compared to popping a pill.
That's right.
I would also, this may be a little cynical, but I think that there are certain scientists who might be financially incentivized to find that there is,
that's dangerous.
A chemical imbalance that can be addressed by
the
drugs.
Squiddies are going to come.
Yeah, the Squiddies are coming for us. They've sent them out.
Say that.
They've sent them out.
They've sent them out. But no, it's. I mean, what you said is actually, there are journal articles. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what they are, but they've done research where they looked at, and this is with antidepressants in particular, when the research was funded by an independent organisation with exactly the same protocol, number of people, context, era, all of that stuff, the results were skewed in favour of the antidepressants when it was privately funded versus publicly funded. So,
but this is like, that's just getting at like, seek and ye shall find.
Yeah.
It's not just about psychiatry and drugs and stuff. This is just a problem that we have with science.
Yeah.
And its interaction with economics.
That's right. Science is political always and forever. And, for those positivists out there who think that science is pure, check yourself.
Done.
Ultimate!
Okay, so now, in order to transition, or just before
we transition, I do want to add one little thing, which was a bit about the history here, which was that Stan Grove was...
That's where I wanted to go to.
Oh, okay.
Stan, yeah.
Oh, okay.
As in not leave this paper behind.
I thought you were going to the next paper. I was like, hang on.
No.
Okay. Oh my God, we've got so much to get through.
That's what I'm saying.
Okay.
We're merely leaving behind the experimental psychosis project, which was interesting in itself. But now enter Stanislav Grof.
Stanislav.
So I do want to so there's a section here, and I'm quoting again from Sarah Marks. In the autumn of 1956, just after completing his medical school training, Grof agreed to be a participant in Rubicek's study. And then down later, so Grof takes some LSD, and he says, quote, "I was hit by a vision of light of incredible radiance and supernatural beauty. It made me think of the accounts of mystical experiences I had read about in spiritual literatures, in which the visions of divine light were compared with the incandescence of millions of suns. It crossed my mind that this was what it must have been like at the epicenter of the atomic explosions in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. I felt that a divine thunderbolt had catapulted my conscious self out of my body. I lost my awareness of the research assistant, the laboratory, the psychiatric clinic, Prague, and then the planet. My consciousness expanded at an inconceivable speed and reached cosmic dimensions. There were no more boundaries or difference between me and the universe." And so that's obviously, set Stanislav Grof on his particular path.
Do you relate to any of that material?
I do, yeah.
Because it reminds me of some of the trip reports you've told me about before. In particular, the idea of being at the epicenter of an atomic explosion.
Yeah, so I think my experience, and I have conveyed to you the idea of being at the center of something. I think it wasn't an atomic explosion.
Okay.
I just intuit that it's just being at the center of an atom.
Right.
That's not exploding, but it's just atoming.
I think you've described it as folding in on itself and then again and again, kind of like, have you ever heard of that, I don't want to say kooky, strange physicist Nassim Haramein?
No.
He's quite a prolific scientist or pseudoscientist, depending on who you ask, who posits some really radically different ideas about physics. And in particular, he's famous for his torus, the torus shape, like a donut that's folding in on itself.
Oh, I thought you meant the bull.
No, it's TORUS.
Okay.
And he uses this model to explain why electrons have spin and all this sort of wacky stuff.
I'm looking at a torus now. So it looks like an inflatable donut.
But it has movement in his model, and it's
what you go tubing. You go tubing down the river in Arizona with a case of beers.
Yeah. When you describe your experience of being at the center, I picture something like that. I don't know if that's at all what you're talking about.
It's not so much a tube as a sphere.
Okay.
But it's not a. It's I guess it's like a yin yang almost, a spherical yin yang that goes like this.
Yeah. That sounds kind of like the torus that I'm talking about.
Is that a fucking representative of a tech?
It's listening
to us.
Siri is listening to us.
We already talked about the squiddies that are. You basically just gave a GPS point to the squiddies.
I did, you're right.
To be like, we're here. We're doing some thought crime. Come arrest us.
Here. Like this.
Yeah, that's more like
that's the torus. See how it's moving and spinning in on itself?
Yeah.
Anywho, look it up. Nassim Haramein. He's a fascinating character.
Yeah, and so then starts the second half of this paper, which talks about LSD and its therapeutic use. And so instead of the researchers taking these psychedelic drugs to try to get insight into the psychosis, now they're talking more about using LSD and psychedelic drugs in order to enhance the therapeutic process. So one thing that I wanted to inquire with you about, there's a section here where Marx writes, as Grof became reconciled with the therapeutic value of physical contact, he became interested in emerging approaches which actively made use of touch in psychotherapy. Later down, McCrurick observed that some patients undergoing LSD psychotherapy appeared to regress into infantile states requiring affection and comforting. The therapist consequently stood in for the parental figure. Where are we with current therapy models in terms of touch? And I guess in normal therapy, non-psychedelic therapy, can you touch? And then obviously the more controversial psychedelic psychotherapy and touch. Is that something that's... Where do we stand on that?
It's still, I would say, very taboo in the mainstream, and most psychiatrists and psychologists would be like, no, it is antithetical to my training to touch. It's inappropriate.
Yeah.
Part of that's the risks, the risks of inappropriate touch. Part of it is also like the history of psychology and psychiatry and wanting to be like this neutral kind of role in a person's life, kind of moving away from a relational way of working with someone where you're actually working with them like a teammate or a co-researcher, and you care about the person. Old school methods were more about being this objective, neutral observer who was able to instigate processes into the unconscious, and using touch would, it might thwart the transference, and we must not do that. And now it's just like risky, business to touch your clients.
Risky in that, like, you might get sued.
Yeah, you might get sued. It's taboo in the industry, so your colleagues are going to be like, WTF, what are you doing?
That's inappropriate.
That's inappropriate. And and then there's also genuine risks with touch, that if you're not trained in it, you don't quite know what you're doing. Somebody is in a freeze or friending response or fawning response. They're sort of allowing a touch out of fear or something like that. Then, even if it's just a touch on the shoulder, if they're doing it from that place of fear, then that's probably going to be doing more harm than good. So there are genuine risks. And then, but what is often not spoken about is the risks of not touching. Which in the realm of psychedelic therapy is quite big, because when people take these big doses, they often do regress to like pre-verbal early childhood traumatic experiences where, say, a parent was unavailable or neglectful, and in that state, the child state that they're in, they reach out for the affection they never got. And to not step in and provide that in a healthy way is just re-traumatizing
so
this
it's
person.
Like this drug experience has opened up the opportunity to rewrite the person's childhood relationship with touch and people, and then they've missed it.
That's it.
By not being touched, then it's just cementing that same blockage.
That's right. Yep. Yeah, that's it exactly.
How fucking sad.
Yeah. Okay, so circling back to where we're at. So Stan didn't want to be a traditional psychotherapist, saw an opportunity to be on an LSD trial, and he went, hell yeah. And then he had a visionary mystical experience of the universe. And then they started to experiment with LSD as an adjunct to psychotherapy. And that's when they started to get a little bit woo in like a mainstream psychiatric research facility, which was at that time under the sort of like communist regime where, you would maybe expect there to be some more heavy-handed controls on such alternative experimentation. But as this article illustrates, that the writings and the published research and experiments of this group in Czechoslovakia was very much in keeping with the West and in sync with the West.
But it brings up an interesting point because, and this is earlier in the article, Marx writes, psychiatrist Milan Hausner, who's been actively involved in LSD research until its cessation in 1974, argues that this extended period of research was possible because regulations within Czechoslovakia were strict enough to prevent the drug leaving the clinical setting, so it never became a recreational drug in the way that happened in North America. So it's like they had this period where, and I think there were some strong figures in the research who had a lot of clout, and they were saying like, we're doing this research. They got enough support from the party, the Communist Party. They were like, okay, you do your thing.
And they at the beginning of their papers, they would like mention researchers like Pavlov and, to kind of...
Yeah, don't worry. Yep.
We're on board.
But they benefited from the LSD not hitting the streets.
Yeah.
Which brings up an interesting argument, and I think it's like the difference between Huxley and Leary. That Leary was like, LSD's for everybody. We should all be taking this. And Huxley's like, we want to keep this contained. This is for the elites to work with. And, you know, there's pros and cons, because by it not hitting the streets in Prague, it allowed this group of researchers to go into depth and to get some amazing results. Unfortunately, they did fall in line with America and the rest of the world in shutting down the LSD research.
But it just took longer. They got to do it.
They had
the longest running
years,
project. Yeah.
They had a few more years at it.
And they got into some really cool sort of transpersonal material. Perinatal, transpersonal.
Well, yeah, I was just thinking that Groff develops his ideas about the perinatal matrices.
Yeah.
As part of this research. So he presents his theory at the Psychiatric Research Institute in 1968, this is, asserting that the patient had to relive the 4 stages of birth, termed basic perinatal matrices. If the fetus was subjected to threat or trauma in any of these stages, psychological difficulties would present later in life, with particular conditions relating to each stage. In order for the personality to be reconstructed, the trauma had to be resolved by revisiting the birth experience in the therapeutic context, which ties in with what you were saying before about these people who are potentially reliving trauma and then kind of needing that touch to help them out of it, rewire, remap their relationship to touch and that kind of thing, and that without that therapeutical benefit, they can't heal.
That's right. Yeah. Yep. And yeah, Groff knew it, and there's a whole sort of like method that Groff kind of developed of how to use touch, which, you know, obviously continued on to his breathwork practice, this holotropic breathwork, which he developed later on.
When LSD research was shut down, so he had to go to other methods.
Yeah. And, you know, if you've ever been to a breathwork session these days, you know, often the breathwork practitioners will use touch to support your process. And this is where it all kind of started.
Okay, I'm going to read this. Milan Hausner kept a collection of drawings and paintings produced by his patients during his time at Sadska. One such image shows a man reaching down to touch a large stone, around which are also images of dinosaurs. The patient stated, "I am regressing into my childhood, which seems to be a prehistoric age. I am searching, leaving these stones unturned." Hausner described this as having ontogenetic and phylogenetic components, indicating that the patient had regressed not only to childhood, but to prehistoric memories of earlier evolutionary states stemming from the collective unconscious. A further example was his colleague, young psychiatrist named Jacob, who quote, spent 5 hours of his LSD training in deep phylogenetic and archetypal regression, during which he experienced himself as a primitive reptile standing on 4 legs, saying nothing, only baring his teeth and trembling.
Whoa. Man, that's so interesting. I was like chatting to my partner about this just last night, this idea of epigenetic memory being passed down generation to generation. And, you know, in this case, going all the way back to when we were...
it's not just into like past human life, but all through mammalian history, then into reptilian.
Yeah. But how? How could memory transmit? And I know, you know, they've done those experiments with the mice where they give a mice a piece of cheese, and then the mice goes up to eat the piece of cheese, and just before it gets there, it gets an electric shock, right? And then from there on, whenever you put the smell of cheese or you put a piece of cheese, the mice is frightened of it. And then they take that mice outside of that environment, put them somewhere else, get them to make babies, never show them cheese again. They have babies, and then their babies have babies. 14 generations later, the babies will, if you put a piece of cheese in front of them, will still be afraid of it.
Yeah.
I don't get, I mean, they say that it can be passed down epigenetically, like the idea that certain genes are switched on or off, and then that information is sort of somehow carried on into the embryo of the child. I guess maybe there is some explanations for it.
Doesn't it? So it's like either an individual has to learn everything in their lifetime, or some information is passed down or through genetics. So it's like, does the child have to learn that a snake is dangerous, or is some of that already in there?
Yeah. Well, some of it must be. I guess that's the point.
Yeah.
And some of it gets put in, maybe like in utero. And I think this example here sort of talks about that quite aptly, which is an example from Groff's work in this paper. And this is a more local version of the reptile memory. And he had an interaction with a patient. I quote, "Therapeutic regression sometimes went beyond early experiences to the transpersonal dimension. Two of Groff's research subjects at the time at the Prague clinic appeared to relive experiences of family members during their sessions. For example, Nadja, a psychologist aged 50, underwent a hallucination in which she was aged 4 in 1902, dressed in starched clothing and surrounded by family under a staircase, feeling ashamed and unable to live up to the demanding standards of the adults around her. When she later began to describe this memory to her own family, her mother completed the story with the exact same details that Nadja had recalled, convincing both her and Groff that the experience recollected was actually that of her mother. In a further session with Renata, I think this is the name of the mother, Groff observed that the patient was describing the undergoing of an execution at the Battle of Bilohora in 1621. Renata later wrote to Groff once he had emigrated to the US to inform him that her father had recently been carrying out a genealogical research and had discovered that they were descended from a nobleman executed at Bilohora, a fact that she claimed not to have known at the time. Okay, so Renata is not the mother of Nadja. It's just a different patient with a completely different story, but both exemplifying that same process of memory transmission. Well, so it appears. It kind of begs that question, that philosophical question of consciousness and what it is, and is it an emergent property from the brain, or is consciousness something that is sort of like woven into the fabric of the universe and is just kind of bent and molded by the brain in this person's experience,
or like tapped into, accessed,
like the radio kind of analogy or something like that. And examples like this make me think, well, maybe it's not just an emergent property of the brain. Maybe it's something more is going on here that we don't yet understand.
And maybe we would have a better understanding of it if LSD research like this was not shut down in the 70s and rather was allowed to continue by research scientists then, and we would have 50 more years.
Yeah, imagine that.
Because in 1976, the research group at Sadska was closed down as the clinic was merged into another local hospital and the production of LSD by Spofa had ceased. Milan Hausner later explained that this move was the result of both a conservative shift in the psychiatric community and the attitude of the regime, more specifically during the, quote, normalization period of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1969, possibly in light of the anxiety over recreational use of LSD in the United States.
Yeah. What a fascinating paper.
Yeah.
Turns out that that they, despite which political regime they were under, they actually pushed ahead with this research further than anywhere else in the world.
Yeah. Maybe we should embrace communism.
I think that's the clear take-home message here.
Communism's better for research.
Yeah. Let's start a LSD communist cult.
An LSD commune?
Yeah, I've never heard of anything like that happening before, and I've definitely not heard any negative.
No. With us in charge of such a commune.
Yes, the beneficent dictators.
What could go wrong?
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the episode. For more episodes or to support the podcast, please follow the links in the show notes or go to alteredmates.com. Adios, amigos!